Regulators, what should their role really be? Which ones pass the Gambling Insider fit and proper person test? Will Tom Watson ever leave us alone? All this and more on the GI Huddle. Welcome back, listeners. It's episode 4 of the GI Huddle. I'm David Cook and I'm back with the one, the only Gambling Insider editorial team. To my right is a man who's never afraid to break the regulations. It's Tim Poole.
Hello everyone.
Sat in front of me, a man who we feared would need plenty of regulation at last week's Gambling Insider summer party. It's Nathan Joyce.
Hi there.
Also sat in front of me is a man so cool he'll never need a regulator. It's Matthew Enderby.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody.
Apologies for any biasness there as well. I've previously been told I'm being a bit too nice to some and a bit too nasty to others.
I'm used to it.
On some of these intros.
So good.
Yeah.
Well deserved.
Yeah. Feel free to make any. Feel free to complain to HR for any unfair treatment.
We'll flip it around 1 week.
Yeah. We haven't heard that one before.
So to bring you onto the topic of this week's podcast, really we see such a contrast across different markets. Particularly when we look at the US and we see regulation moving forward, and in Europe we see the general trend and narrative of regulation being reined in. Asia, it's still a broadly unregulated market, and we see regulators taking what seems very different roles across the different markets. So I'll start with a broad question to go to the floor. What really should be the role of a regulator?
The role of a regulator really, in essence, is to optimise a market or an industry. And what a lot of regulators, as our Gambling Insider columnist Steve Donahue has often pointed out, have missed is that that means promoting the industry, not promoting, but operating with the interests of the industry as well as the players and all the stakeholders in that market. So essentially, a regulator should clamp down on sort of the bad behaviour, but make sure the market can grow as much as possible, maximise revenue, everything like that, as well as protecting, parties like the players and things like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's hard to disagree really. I think that there's an element where regulators especially have to not try to be everybody's friend though. I think sometimes the Gambling Commission can be a bit guilty of this in that they don't want to piss off the operators, they don't want to piss off politicians or different bodies, and they sort of take a neutral point of view, and I don't think that is going to benefit anybody.
So when we look at what's happened, especially in the last year with Great Britain, Belgium and Italy, I think Great Britain is a bit different. It's not necessarily one thing. It starts with the FOBTs and now it goes into other things like advertising, like credit card gambling. Belgium and Italy is really just about the advertising. Is the extent of that regulation something the industry really should have been prepared for before this point? Should we actually be having as many discussions as we're having at this point? Should the industry have addressed these issues beforehand?
I do think there's an element of that. I think that if operators had taken the first step and been sort of seen the way things were going, they could have prevented as much of this regulation coming in, and it could have been a case of we are mindful of the way that the industry is perceived and the way the businesses are being carried out. So it wouldn't be so much as the regulators slamming the industry and imposing these regulations. It would be a case of maybe the operators taking that first step.
Yeah, true, but for how long has there been empty threats? I mean, if the operators can carry on getting away with so many things and maximising business, it's the same with sort of any line of work or any industry. You'd exploit that as much as you can until you're slapped on the wrist and told not. But there were so many potential sort of empty threats with doing it. It's not until now where it's become so strict. But I feel that if they're allowed to exploit this and sort of push the boundaries and sort of fill the pockets, I mean, who's not going to?
Well, I think the issue was partially when you looked at the advertising, because there may have been a fear that over here in the UK we would end up with the complete ban like we've got in Belgium and Italy. But perhaps their proactive actions, we don't know if GVC was just pulling a PR stunt when it was talking about ending all the sponsorship, but in terms of the self-imposed ban like we're seeing next season, I just wonder, should we have seen more examples like that in other areas? Do they now have to do something with credit cards before it gets worse? Do they have to do something more with sponsorship before it gets worse?
If they're tackling one problem, it opens up a whole new load of problems which were sort of underlined and sort of maybe going amiss. So like you say there about the credit cards, we never would have probably thought about that until like the advertisement has been dealt with. As soon as one problem is dealt with, it opens another door to another problem. It's sort of once you've opened, it's the old cliche of opening a can of worms, isn't it really? And one problem will lead to another, and that's where it seems to have escalated, and this is why we're seeing a continuous amount of problems at the moment.
Well, I mean, when we do see further regulation affecting matters, I wonder really what the effect that has on the smaller operators. I mean, the larger operators might have to downsize, but nobody's really fearing about the entire future of the companies, especially when they've got so many markets to operate in. But when you've maybe got a smaller operator that wants to come in and get cut through in the market, could we perhaps then see the smaller operators being pushed towards maybe more grey markets like we see across Asia?
Yeah, that could happen. I mean, you brought up GVC's call to arms essentially to the industry to act better when it comes to advertising, and that could definitely put up barriers to smaller companies and sort of force them abroad, force them into grayer markets, and that's sort of unfair on them in some ways, like because they're not the ones causing them problems in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's an inevitability about it. Really, I think all operators will at some stage or another be pushed towards grey markets because regulation. Smaller operators looking to enter the UK now, we hear a lot of them saying we're going to take the UK market by storm, but we know that they're not because it's such a saturated market, and obviously there's other examples all across the world. Whether regulation pushing them towards grey markets is a bad thing depends on what type of regulation it is, because if it's the right regulation that everyone agrees is needed, or if it's too far, like Italy, for example, then that's sort of a different issue.
But then, I wouldn't necessarily just class the US in this next question when we talk about up-and-coming gambling markets. I'd look at places like Malta as well, or like Gibraltar, places that have opened their arms to gambling operators coming in and setting up, the headquarters there. Do we think the general attitudes towards regulation will always be different in the markets that are seen as more, maybe in inverted commas, up-and-coming, as opposed to the traditional ones?
It's yes and no, isn't it? I think the fact that all of these issues have come to light now, I think a lot of operators will be more cautious heading into it. Maybe not in the US. I still feel like that is so brand new and so exciting in a way. People are sort of forgetting about that. But like you said, with the smaller places like Gibraltar and Malta, I think they will be more cautious purely because of what is happening in the UK, and like Tim touched upon with Italy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to chime in and say that I think yes, up and coming markets such as US and definitely Malta will always be sort of more positive. But then you've also got kind of places like Macau, where gambling is central. So even though the government there will try and look to get as much revenue as possible from other sources, they will always be pretty positive towards it. And I think it sort of depends on maybe even the specifics of the nation, like the culture and the politics, but definitely, in up and coming markets. For example, in the UK, when we go back in time, obviously it was quite liberal, and it's ironic, obviously, that it was Labour that liberalised the gambling sector here, and now we obviously have a lot of backlash from that particular party.
And up and coming can be, while sort of gambling in England may have been more established for a longer period, when online gambling came in, that could be considered an up-and-coming market in its own right, and that was just sort of there for the taking, really, and everyone just kind of moved in and really made all their money there.
It always seems to be the same thing, doesn't it? It's like, when you talk about Macau, there's a realisation that gambling can boost the economy, so they open up regulations and open it up to foreign operators. Then the operators grow the market over a period of time, and then we start to look at things like, hang on, how much money is coming from the VIPs? There might be what they so often call, and I hate the term, crackdown on VIPs and junkets and all these kind of things. It almost feels as though when we want something to drive the economy, that's when all the regulations open up. But then as soon as anything starts to go wrong, all the regulations start to come down. So how do you get to a point where gambling's already established in a market, but the operators don't really seem to take advantage of it, or the operators don't do anything that alerts regulators to reining it in?
I think education and communication are always going to play their part here. But it might just be the nature of things in that certain operators will always take advantage, but certain also, as we see in the UK, certain politicians and certain parties will always look to oppose gambling. I think this could just be the natural cycle of things, and as long as there's a good minimum, a good base, then these peaks and troughs can kind of sort of be manageable.
Yeah, gambling's a difficult one, isn't it? Because there's always going to be people who have such a strong opinion on it, even though they don't really know much about it. They might know what blackjack is, or or slots or something like that, and they still quite automatically have this negative perception. Whereas, there's just a lot more to it than that, right? I mean, it's just like any other industry. There's going to be operators who are following the letter of the law and are going about things in the right way, But then there's also those who are going to push and push and just try to sort of stretch every penny out of every possibility.
Okay, so when we look at the US, I think we've got a very different view towards an organisation like the American Gaming Association. And it's worth pointing out the AGA is not a regulator. The US is obviously a complicated one. It's not necessarily got one regulator. It's got 50 regulators, in a sense, or 50 governments that can look into gambling. But we do see the AGA making a lot of noise. They talk a lot at industry events. They debate matters like the integrity fees issue, for example. They send out a lot of data on the topic. I don't see another organisation really blowing the industry's trumpet quite like they do across any other market. So from the industry's perspective, should we actually be looking more at gaming industry associations for help as opposed to regulators who might say our role is not necessarily to help you?
Yeah, I think it's an easy answer to that one. I think that's brilliant. That's what the AGA is doing has made a big difference in the US, and what we have in the UK by comparison is sort of there's the reality, but there's the public narrative, and because of that narrative, a lot of people aren't actually sure what the reality really is, because there's a lot of gambling bashing, and there's not enough of a unified voice, which is something Kevin Dale wrote about in our magazine. Actually, there's not enough of a unified voice against it. If people were to speak out and use facts and figures, and obviously acknowledge failures, because we're not going to say that the gambling industry is full of angels and no errors at all. That could change things significantly in terms of there's a lot of praise for the Gambling Commission when I speak to neutral parties. So when I interview people who don't work in the industry but work with gambling companies, there's a lot of praise for the Commission, but they don't know about the things that the Commission necessarily does wrong. What the gambling industry could benefit from is one voice that says, well, actually, yeah, they've done this wrong. We're going to work with them to help, to make sure that they can get things right and the operators can get things right as well.
Now, when we look at somewhere like Sweden, for example, another very powerful gambling market, we have still seen the operators being pulled up on things like self-exclusion failures, bonusing failures. But this is a market that has opened up this year to private operators. So is that perhaps the best example of how a market should open up, where you've got this market growth being encouraged by the regulator, but the regulator at the same time is still coming down hard on operators when they step out of line? It's not like what so many other regulators have done, which is allow gambling to open up, let things fester, then come down hard on it, or have government talk about it in a negative way.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of how the industry should be run. When they first opened up, they made it quite clear, like, these are the rules, you've got to follow them. And I think it was in February they wrote an open letter to operators saying you're not quite doing a good enough job here. And then very quickly after that was like, no, you've had your chance, and we're gonna you're gonna point out and fine you when you make these mistakes again. And I think that's essential.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder with Sweden, just because there's this whole sort of global gaming story at the moment where they've had their license revoked, and they're saying that the regulator wasn't actually clear enough when speaking to them. So kind of maybe we'll give Sweden a few more months, but it does sound like they're doing the right thing. When they come down hard on operators, I think we should be careful not to praise them for that and then criticise the Gambling Commission for doing the same. So I think when the Gambling Commission does fine, especially when things like anti-money laundering and issues like that, I think having a strong hand, no one can complain about that really.
Yeah, as long as it's in black and white, one strike only, or how the Swedish market is doing, that's how it should be, I think, worldwide, to be honest.
Well, there was talk a second ago about the Gambling Commission. This brings us on to the juicy bit, listeners. Well, after the next one, because Nathan, I was going to talk about an article that you wrote recently about the UK government and how perhaps they should address gambling industry reform as a whole rather than on a piecemeal basis. And I should just say, by the way, this is a shameless little plug for what's coming up in Gambling Insider September, October, by the way. You can read all about it. But you talked about how the Gambling Commission fits into that. But really, is that possible when gambling is often used as a political football? Let's be honest. And, if you're the Labour Party, if you're the Conservative Party, do you want gambling being addressed in one go when that gives you fewer things to hammer home one by one to try and win votes?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is possible to do it once, but at the end of the day, if everything must be discussed all in one a month down the line, I mean, how are people meant to moan about gambling? If you address every single problem you have at once, I mean, that's perfect for the gambling industry as a whole, because they just have to deal with a few weeks or a couple of things of backlash, and then once that's over with, they're sort of scot-free, because then Labour can't come out and be like, oh, well, what about this? Because at the end of the day, that should have been addressed. If that's all addressed at once, it plays into the hands of the gambling operators and gambling companies, which is what the UK government doesn't want, hence why they drag in their feet. So we all saw with FOBTs, that was addressed first. Online gambling wasn't even mentioned, when we know that that's probably, arguably, a bigger problem. So the fact that that wasn't even spoken about until the maximum state reduction for FOBTs was introduced, that just goes to show exactly what the UK government are going to be doing. And then obviously the same with credit cards, they're just filtering it out, delaying it, and making sure their point of view is put across to the public, and it's just a negative one.
I mean, I definitely agree that they sort of, their agenda, their criteria is like, oh, it's a new month, how are we going to say bad things about gambling this month?
Yeah.
And we're going to figure that out. But at the same time, I don't know, like trying to handle it all in one, and I think the nature of these problems is such that you can't necessarily do that, because especially with online things and the way technology keeps changing at such a rapid pace, like it's changing faster than they can write legislation, that's for sure.
Yeah, but some things go hand in hand, like online gambling and credit card, but to me it looks as if they're dealing that separate matters
issues.
And they're sort of like prolonging it. So I'm not saying sit down at every single problem, create a huge list, as long as you're armed, and talk about them, but some things which can coincide with each other, like online gambling and credit card usage.
But then when you look at it, how long did the FOBT saga take overall to first be talked about and eventually be resolved? I mean, I think it was at least 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
And I think that was one issue. I mean, it was a very massive issue, don't get me wrong, but...
And going back to that, I feel like the Gambling Commission didn't really help themselves out there, because obviously it was going to be reduced, well, obviously it's been reduced to £2, and then they sort of came out when that number was popping up, they sort of came out and revealed sort of then that, oh, well, we actually wanted it to be £30. That's not really benefiting anybody, in particular themselves. That's sort of undermining themselves in a way.
Yeah, that was kind of a case of them trying to be friends to everyone.
They're trying to stay on the fence, because they've just made themselves like idiots.
We're going to lower it, but we shouldn't go all the way down, because that's going to piss off the operators. But we have to do it, because otherwise the politicians are going to get angry with us, and it's just kind of like trying to keep everyone happy. But in the end, nobody wins, especially not the player, because it's just.
And then it's not black and white, which we all agreed on earlier, how the regulator should be. Yeah, to come out and say that, it's just so wishy-washy.
Because I think their term, or the language that they use on the website was, we'll recommend the high value of £30 or something below, which is kind of like a wishy-washy, weak statement for them to go with,
isn't it?
For such a big issue that's sort of wrapped up the whole industry and media.
But maybe it's driven more by us, the public, in the sense that when you look at the US, all the regulators at one time were talking about online casino and online poker. Then they were talking about DFS all the time. Now they're all talking about sports betting. And the reason why that changes is because it's what the public are talking about. They're concerned, first and foremost, what are the public talking about? What does the public want us to address? Yeah,
that's sort of like the end of the day. That's why the politicians want to have something to say about gambling, whether it's good or bad. Because people are always want to talk about it themselves, right? Most likely it's going to be a negative thing, or a negative public perception, so they always want to be addressing that. So it all does start with sort of the public, really.
No, it's all negative, isn't it? There's I've not seen anything positive with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the key thing about Regulator, is to separate the noise from the reality, because the EFL English Football League did a survey recently, and we've covered this, we've written about this. 71% of football fans think that gambling sponsorship is fine, is okay, is acceptable. So 71% of the public actually don't have a problem with it. So it's certain people driving that narrative, and they'll make it seem like 99.9% hate it. It's all terrible. It's all.
And that survey was actually on decent numbers, wasn't it?
Exactly.
When you compare it,
the sample size was strong.
Exactly.
So a regulator has got to, like Matt said earlier, is when the government are pressing for this and that, they've got to ignore, just like an operator would be pleading not to fine them for something they know they've done. When politicians are pleading for things to be done on not basing it on anything, the regulator should say, well, no, we're going to do what's in the interests of the market or of the industry, not individual operators, but to make sure we're doing our job the best.
So now let's talk about everybody's favourite MP in this office, Mr. Tom Watson. I want to say before we go any further, by the way, listeners, that Tom Watson did once appear on the cover of Gambling Insider magazine, back in 2013, 2014. This was before any of us worked for Gambling Insider, and in that, he wrote an article basically asking for the FOBTs to have heavier regulation than what they had at the time. I think you have MPs that have ulterior motives. I don't personally believe that any MP that really cares about people would so easily want regulation to come in that's going to make thousands of people unemployed, without really basing much of his argument on any evidence or actual investigation. And then obviously now it comes to other things like credit cards and the advertising, what have you, and he's always the face of the anti-gambling narrative that we see across the media. So what can we actually do though about the, and let's be honest, it can go the other way as well. You can obviously have pro-gambling MPs or pro-gambling senators who have ulterior motives as well. But what can we actually do though when government themselves might have ulterior motives with regards to gambling? Because that, in a way, that can make it harder for the regulators to make gambling safe, can't it?
Yeah, well, before anyone starts to lay into Tom Watson, you've got to look at.
You haven't got long.
I know, this is why I thought I'd pitch him first. You've got to look at MP Paisley. What's his? I can't remember his first name.
Oh, God,
Ian,
yeah.
I think.
Ian Paisley, that's the one. Yeah, who's probably been one of the loudest MPs to shout about how much gambling is ruining lives and etc. etc. You know the spiel, but then obviously it all came out about him accepting presents from betting operators in excess of £1,000 to go VIP experience for a football game. So if that's coming out, you can't really be shouting from the rooftop saying how bad it is when you're willing to take a family member or a friend to an expensive event, all paid by operators, which is obviously coming from those vulnerable families, which you're claiming to be. So
you see Tom Watson mainly, talking about things like Britain's hidden health epidemic. Those are strong words, really, really strong words. And it was about a month ago that he wrote in the sort of Parliament magazine that this is the case. It's a health epidemic. We need to solve this. And then February in this year, I looked back to a statement that he made, and it was exactly the same language.
Tom Watson is not helping. That's all I can say on him, really.
go on, expand a little bit more.
Well, I think I agree with everything Matt said. The problem is, I suppose, as an industry, we can't necessarily complain about politicians who always criticise gambling or this or that, because politics that's the nature.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Nathan's example earlier.
That complex name.
Yeah, was summed it up really. Again, we're not sitting here saying all politicians are wrong or anything like that, but I think when we look back to Tracy Crouch, everyone's favourite politician as well. I just
be very careful before you do any very strong criticism of any Kent MP, by the way. But in this case, I
just think back to she made up a few numbers, or maybe a speechwriter fed her those numbers. They were blatantly wrong. She used them to sort of fall on a sword and resign. And I kind of just think, what was all that about, really? What did it achieve? Nothing. It was just it was all very strange. Didn't help anyone.
No, exactly. But the other issue that I have with regulators, and this is from any experience of featuring them in the magazine or interviewing them, and I remember speaking to DGE before on Gambling Commission. I think we've had Malta Gaming Authority in the mag quite a few times.
Yep.
Getting them to actually say anything,
yeah,
if you all agree, is actually a challenge in itself, because they often seem to be very neutral in what they try and say. And you might say, what more can a regulator say other than we're trying to keep gambling safe? But do they really? I use the Gambling Commission as part of this as well, certainly, but do they really need to have a stronger voice in actually making themselves heard? Do a lot of people know who the Gambling Commission are, what they do?
Maybe not a stronger voice, maybe a stronger approach. I think that will speak a lot louder rather than shouting from the rooftops, like we spoke before again about just drawing the line and sticking to it and not sort of straying from it. But obviously you brought up the Gambling Commission there, and we spoke about with the FOBTs, and they did. And if you're going to say, oh well, we wanted, I know I went back to it, but go and say, oh, we did want £30 instead of £2, that's not having a strong backbone, is it? So if you've got a strong approach, that naturally gives you stronger authority and that stronger voice without having to shout and clamp people down. So I think it's all about how you approach situations. Have the rules in place, implement them and stick with them, don't stray from them, don't let one or two slide, just have it in place, black and white, and then that's everything they've done within their power is there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I went to a press event a couple of weeks ago, and they while there were lots of talk about all kinds of things, it was their annual enforcement report that came out, so that's what the event was
Yeah.
kind of based around. But they were really talking about their message for the future and how they really want operators to increase their points of contact with their players and really understand their players. And there was a handful of journalists in the room, and that's what they just kept going back to it. They kept going back to it, like, this is our message, this is what we are delivering to operators now, this is what we expect of them, this is what we need them to achieve. And I had to see that in a positive way, because they're doing that. It's like they're making it black and white. So they're making it, this is a very important expectation that they need the businesses to achieve and to get to.
Yeah, well, my 2 cents on that is it's a tricky one. It would certainly make our jobs easier as journalists if they spoke more, but I suppose I can understand. I think ideally, if they're approached for comment and to explain or justify certain decisions, they should always be doing that. I think that because you can really increase your credibility by doing that. They don't necessarily have to go out of their way. But one thing that's slightly different from the Gambling Commission, but the Advertising Standards Authority, which is another regulator, when they banned the Sky Bet advert, which we discussed in our, I think it was our opening GI Huddle,
We did, yeah.
they've now overturned that. And I think the way they've gone about that, they've made it quite clear what they've done. They made it clear they made a mistake, and they weren't afraid to admit that publicly. Of course, they didn't shout about it, but they simply published it on their
It's
website.
like refs
So I
with
think
VAR when they get it wrong, happy to overturn the decision for the better.
Exactly, yeah. So a stronger voice can certainly, in that regard, is great. And I consider that a sign of strength when you can admit, you've done something wrong and you're prepared to change it.
That would be a lot more fun, just think about it, wouldn't it? Why don't we have, a kind of a headquarters where you've got like Gambling Commission video assistants just looking at things that have happened in shops, and then they can make the square signal, and then
3 challenges per operator.
Yeah,
per
3
year.
challenges per operator. Yeah, make it like the challenge system in tennis. Yeah.
Don't see anything wrong with that, really.
Gambling Commission, if you're listening,
And Tom Watson, if you're listening.
Anton Watson, if you're listening. Yeah, I might expect a phone call from you sometime soon. Let's sum up then. What do we think makes an ideal regulator? What do we want first and foremost from our regulator?
So I think someone who is a body that can protect all parties, so protect the players, but not protect operators, but act in the interests of the industry as a whole, like I said at the very beginning. And in terms of specific regulators who I like and the way they're going about it at the moment, I really like the New Jersey, the Division of Gaming Enforcement. I think maybe their fines are a little bit small in actual cost, but they promote the industry very well. Sorry, not as in advertise, but they help it grow. But they do come down on even the biggest names when they do something wrong.
Yeah, I think a clear message from them, from the regulators, is essential. They need to say, this is what we expect of you. You need to be understanding your customer, or you need to be, just following these certain guidelines or laws that we set out, and just holding people to the letter of the law as well. So you're saying, like, if you do cross this line, we're gonna let you know about it, and we're gonna let you know about it straight away. Whether that's a warning system or fine straight away, or somewhere in between that can be determined. But I think, black and white system where it's all clear and laid out, and not trying to be everybody's friend.
Yeah, a bit like how we started. I'll just echo Matt's thoughts there. That's my exact same opinion as well. It just needs to be black and white. Not copying you there, mate, but just agree with what you're saying for what you say. Yeah.
It's like being a parent, isn't it? It's not about being the friend
That's exactly right.
all the time.
That's it.
Well, that brings us to a close. We've just got time to tell you about a magazine bonanza coming up for you in the next few months. The July-August editions of Gambling Insider and Gaming America are out now, as is the July edition of our affiliate publication Trafficology. Coming up between now and G2B in October, we've got 3 Trafficologies: Gambling Insider September-October, Gaming America September-October, a Sports Betting Focus, a Global Gaming Awards Las Vegas Shortlist magazine, a G2E preview, and a Partridge in a Pear Tree, all coming your way at some point in the next few months. Keep checking out our mags and news at gamblinginsider.com, as well as our GI Friday newsletter. That's all, folks.